Resuming debate.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable colleagues, I rise today to speak on Bill S-250, an act to amend the Criminal Code sterilization procedures. In my remarks, I will challenge the arguments raised by critics of this bill and express the importance of the legislation brought forward. Colleagues, as you may recall from Senator Boyer's speech, this bill proposes to amend Section 268 of the Criminal Code, which addresses aggravated assault offences, to add a new offence for forced or coerced sterilization. This would establish that anyone involved in coercive measures to cause or attempt to cause someone to be sterilized against their will or without obtaining proper informed consent is guilty of an indictable offence for a maximum of 14 years in prison. As you are aware, this bill came out of the tireless work done by Senator Boyer throughout her career and also at the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights, which completed 2 studies in 2019 and 2022 on forced sterilization in Canada. I sat on the Human Rights Committee for both studies, where we heard from a number of witnesses comprised of medical and legal experts and survivors of forced or coerced sterilization and other experts, all of which gave invaluable testimony on an extremely difficult, painful, and frankly unbelievable subject. At the beginning of the committee's first study, I thought forced sterilization was something of the past, an issue of historical significance that the committee had an interest to look at. When I learned that it still happens today, with reported cases as recent as 2019, I was shocked. How could a country like Canada, that prides itself on being a progressive and avid protector of human rights, allow this deplorable act to happen in the first place and to go on for so long, let alone to now? The more I learned through separate discussions with Senator Boyer, listening to survivors bravely share their stories, and looking at the extensive documentation on forced sterilization in our country, the more I wanted to help bring effective change. Amongst the recommendations by witnesses for the deterrence and eradication of forced sterilization, several survivors told the committee that they wanted a new criminal offence created as a means of greater deterrence and accountability. Some detractors of the bill say that this legislation is not needed, since there are existing legal provisions in the Criminal Code which could be used in court proceedings by a victim of forced sterilization. These include Section 265, assault, 267, assault causing bodily harm, and 268, aggravated assault, all applicable to a medical setting where informed consent for procedure was not present. In addition, the federal government amended the Criminal Code in 1997 to include under aggravated assault the act of female genital mutilation, of which forced sterilization could be closely interpreted as, given the procedures involved in the severing, tying, or cauterizing of the fallopian tubes, ovaries, or uterus. Done forcibly, this procedure could constitute as a form of genital mutilation. And yet, despite all these laws, over 12,000 women have been subjected to the procedure, with not one person charged with assault in this circumstance to date, let alone convicted or otherwise held to account. If the law is not used for such a clear crime as forced sterilization, what is the use of the law existing in the first place? If there is no investigation and therefore no charge and no conviction, there is no consequence. Justice for survivors never comes. Protection of citizens is not upheld. There is something wrong when the laws currently in place are not being utilized to combat forced sterilization. If the existing charges of assault were enough, there would be tens of thousands of charges at the least, or perhaps with the motivation of deterrence, there would be far fewer. I would also like to highlight the fact that these are the recorded numbers, and there are likely thousands of more cases that will never come to light. I want to emphasize again the grave reality that there have been 0 charges laid against this appalling act. It therefore does not make any sense under any circumstances to not have forced sterilization criminalized. Other critics have said this will do little to solve the larger systemic problem, a view with which I adamantly disagree, since this step is crucial for several reasons. First, criminalizing the practice sends a clear message that the government acknowledges forced sterilization as a violation of an individual's human rights and not be tolerated in any way. The threat of criminal prosecution would also act as a deterrent to healthcare providers and institutions that might consider engaging in such practices as a form of control, knowing there are explicit and serious legal consequences. And for those who do perform the procedure, criminalization will hold offenders accountable. While this legislation will not address harms of the past, it will prevent future violations and may provide some comfort to survivors. The law is meant to protect society, deter unlawful actions, and establish precedent. Forced or coerced sterilization is not only assault on the common vernacular on a citizen, in the common vernacular of a citizen, but for the most part on the most vulnerable groups and individuals in Canada. The practice has disproportionately targeted Indigenous women, women of colour, and those with disabilities, and other marginalised groups. In many instances, those forced into the sterilization procedure also had just given birth, suffered a miscarriage, or had an abortion. These women are at their most vulnerable state, physically and mentally. One survivor, Sylvia Tuckanow, told the committee about how she was forcibly moved to an operating room immediately following the birth of her son, where she was administered an epidural and was sterilized despite protest. She stated during her testimony, quote, "I was still disoriented from giving birth and the effects of pain medications. I felt terror and fear as I was taken into the room. I already had an epidural sticking out of my back from giving birth, so I wondered why the nurses needed to do another. During this, I kept saying, 'No, I don't want to do this,' and crying uncontrollably, but nobody listened to me. They tied me down to the bed." Closed quote. Ms. Tuckanow said she still remembers to this day the smell of burning tissue. Another survivor who wished to remain anonymous was waiting for a cesarean delivery and risked going into septic shock. She felt the life of her son was in her hands if she did not sign the consent forms to be sterilized, presented to her before the operation. And she said, I quote, "They brought up tubal ligation. Since they would already be operating on me, they said this would be a quick process. At that point, I didn't give a second guess my decision because the only thing that was on my mind was the survival of my still unborn child and my own survival." Closed quote. Other survivors recounted how doctors took it upon themselves to perform these procedures unknowingly to the patient at the time, and they would only discover years later when attempting to have children. Many were deliberately misinformed by medical providers of the procedure's permanency and the risks, or faced pressure tactics at the time of high emotion and severe pain and disorientation. Colleagues, all the women that came forward to speak before the committee were courageous. Some did not mind their faces being shown and their name being shared. Others did not, for reasons I cannot even begin to imagine. Some of these survivors conducted their testimony under a pseudonym and in silhouette. The reason I share these details with you, colleagues, is to illustrate the level of damage forced sterilization has inflicted upon thousands of women, and in many cases being so severe that they do not want to be identified. Shame was forced upon them. Some of the survivors expressed burying their memories until hearing others speak about similar traumatic experiences. These forced procedures have left many women terrified of the healthcare system so that they avoid necessary care for themselves. Isolation, guilt, and other trauma-induced responses have snowballed in addition to the physical harms and consequences of the procedure. This doesn't even include the effect that it has had and continues to have on the family life of the victims and their partners. Hearing all of this, it is extremely unfortunate that we are still debating the need for such a law. The reality is that forced sterilization is a blatant violation of human rights, and it is time we take decisive action to put guardrails around this procedure and protect vulnerable members of our society. I would like to take a moment in my remarks to commend Senator Boyer for her efforts in bringing to light the issue of forced sterilization in Canada. This is no small feat and a hard reality that has not been addressed on a national level before. No words can convey the pain and trauma victims of forced sterilization endure. Being robbed of the ability and choice to carry life is the utmost violation to bodily autonomy, and full credit and respect goes to our colleague, Senator Boyer, for being the superhero to these victims. colleagues, since criminal law falls under federal jurisdiction, we should consider whether the federal government should provide compensation to victims or provide funding for in vitro fertilization where it is still possible or desired by victims. The government's failure to act is a de facto acquiescence to the practice. Let there be no mistake, as critic of this bill, I am supportive of the bill unamended, unless there are ways to strengthen it even more and to build on the work that Senator Boyer has done, and not just during committee study, but over the course of her career. While I am the critic and my job is to find weakness in the legislation and improve it, I have not found any. What I have found is inaction by governments over the years on what is clearly a violation of human rights and a key provision of medical professionals whose first obligation is to the health and well-being of the patient, not to their societal thinking and prejudices. Forced sterilization is a form of violence and a gross violation of bodily autonomy, and it is unacceptable that such a practice has been allowed to occur in Canada. We have laws that could have prevented this and addressed this, and yet the government has chosen not to use existing assault charges which are at its disposal. Criminalizing forced sterilization not only would deter offenders and hold those responsible accountable, but would also provide a legal recourse for victims. It is long overdue for Canada to take decisive action to criminalize forced sterilization, and that time is now. We must ensure that everyone has the right to make informed decisions about their own bodies and that they are not subject to coercion or force in any form. Bill S-250 is the next right step. Thank you, colleagues.